All right, welcome everybody. Aitzwail, Amiensapquaquilum. Happy Monday. Welcome to our first Lunch and Learn in a Lunch and Learn series this week. Today's topic is on what I think is super important, and I'm sure many of you would agree, hence you're being here today. And that's on navigating Indigenous identity and the really phenomenon of pretend Indianism in professional workspaces today. So, this session and all of the topics that I am featuring in this Lunch and Learn series this week are what I find to be hot topics in the world of the work that we do at LPC. Um, Supporting very large, very corporate organizations on their journey towards truth and reconciliation and embedding Indigenous cultural safety. So these have been hot topics and trends for a long time, and for all of my Indigenous colleagues on the call here, you know this. But these have been hot topics that have been surfacing just recently in our open Q&A sessions for all of the training sessions that we have been delivering. And I was with a client organization that I will not name a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago. And I was delivering a session on transformative leadership. And in the session, during our second session, which was more interactive, workshop style, the topic of honorariums, hiring processes, culturally safer interview processes, and Indigenous verification processes came into conversation. And of course, this was aligned with what was making the news headlines weeks ago, which was the recent story of Thomas King, who was outed as, Indigenous identity fraud. Thomas King, very famous for his work as an author in the literary world in academia, and produced and written many, many books. Inconvenient Indian, one of the most popular. And, of course, those conversations come into our sessions. And so we talked about Indigenous verification in their process. And of course, this is all scalable. All the work we do in cultural safety and reconciliation is scalable. And so, like, there are sometimes we require Indigenous verification, and there are times we do not. And so they were very shocked when I had the recommendation that they should be in a verification process. And then I was like, yeah. And then they were also very shocked when I was like, no, you don't have to do Indigenous verification for that. So we're going to talk more about that today. But I really want to kind of set the intention here that this is more dialogic. And I never really want to blame or shame or out any Indigenous organizations, service providers, any colonial corporate organizations. We're all on a learning journey, and we are in a trajectory. And this work has never really been done before in the history of this country. So, for all my Indigenous colleagues on the call here, we know that there are tremendous organizational growing pains that we are going through when we're trying to embed more Indigenous representation into our organizations to lead reconciliation, decolonization, and cultural safety efforts. So tokenism, Indigenous identity fraud, lateral violence, burnout, these are very common things that come with the Indigenous workforce landscape. And I've seen also in my social media channels that many of our Indigenous colleagues, relatives, feel like it's corporate organizations, it's not their place to have a say in the pretend Indian conversation. And I'm like, I have a little bit of a different take on that. And I say that wholeheartedly because of the context in which we do our work at LPC. We support very large organizations who have very large commitments and very large partnership accords, frameworks, and relational accountability to nations. So, in my mind, there is no place for neutrality if your organization is in one of those commitments, one of those endeavors. There's no room for neutrality. But what I will say is that, there is no room for perfection in it. Perfectionism, if you've ever sat in one of my sessions, perfectionism is a value of colonialism. But I think there is a lot of room for practice, for relational accountability, and or our organizational commitment that each of your respective teams and organizations has towards the Indigenous partners, communities, and nations that we work with. So I just will had it in my heart and in my spirit to hold space for this very important conversation and explore collectively where we can find some ethically driven, values driven strategies to avoiding the pitfall of Indigenous identity fraud and pretend Indianism, and get back to this place of relational accountability for this good work. So I know this can go down the realm of academia, down the realm of what's happening in Indigenous communities. This is a very specific safe time, safe space to talk about what's happening in organizations today, corporate organizations. And I'm only aspiring to have about 25, 30 minutes of content here to share with you. The content I'm sharing with you is content and recommendations, strategies, practices that we are sharing with corporate organizations all across this country. And then I hope to leave as much room as I possibly can to turn our attention to the open Q&A. If you are just joining us, the chat box has been disabled for this particular webinar session. If you come back tomorrow or on Thursday when we talk about some other complicated, challenging conversations in the work that we all do, addressing denialism. And the last one that we are doing on Thursday, that Lunch and Learn series is all about what to do when you have contrasting teachings that are coming into the workplace or contrasting recommendations. You know, one consultant, Indigenous consultant says, this is your recommendation. Another consultant comes in and says, this is your recommendation. How do we hold that space of tension and confrontation when it comes to Indigenous perspectives in the workplace in a way that is healthy and, of course, constructive, and respecting and honoring of Indigenous perspectives and ways of being and doing and knowing? So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get started and do a deeper dive into navigating Indigenous identity and pretend Indianism in corporate workplaces. As I mentioned, the intention here is dialogue, not debate. There is a huge difference between dialogue and debate, and the work that we do at LPC is never ever debate. Debate is hyper colonial, it's hyper oppressive, it is looking for the flaws in somebody else's argument and, trying to explore where they are wrong, which is all about colonialism. But in dialogue, which is really, our Indigenous way of being and doing and knowing, I come from a big house culture where no decisions were ever made behind closed doors. And when decisions needed to be made on behalf of the entire community, it was brought before the entire community for deliberation, for dialogue, from the youngest person to the eldest living member of our community. So this is my approach to holding this conversation, because I know not everybody's going to agree with some of the strategies or recommendations that I may be presenting today, but that's okay. I think that colonialism has us thinking in black and white, this or that. But with dialogue, I'm not. Why can't we just have both? Depending on the context and the relational accountability that should be the anchors for our decision making at the end of the day. I also aspire to hopefully build some clarity on complex issues specific to the corporate sector. Again, I'm not really looking in academia or Indigenous community contexts, but really for what this means for corporate workplaces. Our team has the incredible honor of supporting every sector in this country: education, public education, post-secondary, colleges and universities. We also support large health systems. We also support other governing bodies, social services, so-called justice, you name it, we work with those systems. So I'm really kind of speaking to that corporate culture today that have a duty and a mandate to decolonize, reconcile, or build cultural safety into their infrastructure. My approach is very values driven and ethics driven, not my humble opinion, not my, what Len thinks, but, the values and the ethics that drive a lot of this work. That's my anchor for this 30-minute presentation. And of course, I do want to humbly respect the very diverse experiences, perspectives of all of my Indigenous friends, relatives, and colleagues on this call and listening to this archived video. We don't always have the same perspective on complicated and complex matters, and that's totally okay. And of course, the many, many different cultural diverse backgrounds on this call as well. If you're Indigenous, I'm so glad you're here. If you identify as a non-Indigenous person, a settler, an ally, I'm so glad that you are here as well. So this is not a session about calling anybody out in particular. That's not my style. That's not my approach. This is about a call in to our responsibility. And I know I'm speaking true for you too, we have a responsibility for the work that we do. In these large corporate organizations, whether you're Indigenous or not, we all have a call to responsibility for reconciliation. And I only hope at the end of this 60-minute webinar that you will feel like you will have either broader awareness or language or hopefully some practical tools that you feel like you can add to your professional tool belt moving forward. That should take us up until about 12:40, where I aim to zip it and then hand the floor over to our open dialogue, our open Q&A, where you can raise your hand. That will put you in the queue, or you can put your anonymous questions or tie your name and organization to your question in the Q&A feature. Okay, why now? Why should we be having this conversation now? Well, not just with the emergence of Thomas King and before Thomas King, there was Buffy St. Marie, and somewhere in between there was Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon, that very high profile people that have been outed as pretend Indians. There's being this undertow of Indigenous representation in non-Indigenous organizations and in Indigenous organizations, I will say as well, in First Nations communities, in friendship centers. So I think that, why it matters now is that this is not a trend. It's not a trend that we are seeing, but ultimately what the impacts that the community is feeling is a breach of trust. Oh, that was really big for myself when we learned of Buffy St. Marie. I did not see that one coming. I'm being very honest with you. I did not see that one coming. And I think there was a lot of hurt and pain in the world as well. However, you look to, more recent elements like Thomas King, I've seen from a lot of my academic, scholarly, Indigenous colleagues, they're like, no, we've known this for a long time. And there's been a calling for a long time in the community too, to fact check your ancestry and your family lineage. So this is not so much a trend as it is really just looking at the relationships that are essential to reconciliation work and embedding Indigenous cultural safety so that our organizations are transformative. Organizations with commitments to reconciliation, decolonization, and Indigenous cultural safety cannot stay neutral in this conversation. And if you find that your organization is kind of in that neutral zone, I'm hoping that I can equip you with some language awareness and hopefully tools and strategies that you feel like you might be able to take back to your respective team or organization. If you find yourself in the neutral zone, I don't think that's a bad thing. People show up to our sessions all the time with a huge degree of vulnerability, feeling like they should be doing a lot more than they actually are, which is great. I never ever want anybody to get out of that zone because we all need to be in that zone. But I think it shouldn't come at the cost of silence, of stagnation, or of like, okay, well, we tried our best. We tried our best. This reconciliation thing isn't really working out for us. I really look at it as like a natural pitfall, that a natural growing pain that transformative organizations are going through. It's the same thing with tokenization. Tokenization is not a bad thing. I look at it, I would diagnose it as a consultant as a natural pitfall, which is a step in the right direction, But then you can step back, self-assess, and be like, oh, we fell in this pitfall. We are guilty of this. Okay, that's okay. But now I want you to find the tools, tips, tricks, and strategies to get out of that pitfall and continue your progressive journey towards reconciliation. And this is so much too about, what is happening in public discourse around. I hear this all the time. I'm like, I've been following this story. I've been following this latest piece of work with Indigenous identity fraud, and many leaders across the country on the news and in their own webinars, in podcasts, and YouTube channels are like, we need to figure this out. We need to figure this out. Um, and the country needs to help us figure this out too, because the country is largely to blame for the complex Indigenous identities that we carry today. If you've ever sat in one of my sessions, I always say there's no identity as complicated or complex as Indigenous identity in this country. And that's largely due to, forced assimilation, genocide, the encroachment of religious and cultural colonial values against Indigenous peoples, the 60s scoop, the millennial scoop, the continued forced theft of our children and youth and put into foster care systems today. There's a whole scaffolding that creates very complicated, very violent, very fragmented views of Indigenous identity. At the same time, we have beautiful identities. We have beautiful ways of belonging, connecting, knowing who we are and where we come from that has been untouched by colonialism. And when you look at the relentless track record of wanting to erase us and erase our identities from the fabric of this country, the fact that we still have Indigenous identity today is no small thing. And it's a testament to our own intergenerational strength, our own intergenerational grace, and our own intergenerational resilience. But there's a lot of wiggle room here for where is your social responsibility to the relationships you have with Indigenous communities, to the relationships you have with your mandates and your calls to action, whether it's the truth and reconciliation calls to action, whether it's the recommendations in the In Plain Sight report, whether it's the calls for justice and the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks. We all have our calls to action. We all have our mandate and our obligations. So there's got to be a lot of wiggle room for organizational duty and social responsibility for navigating Indigenous identity in the workplace. And I just want you to think for a moment, if you do find yourself, your organization that's represented here in this virtual space, if you do find yourself in that neutral zone, what do you think is the risk there? Whether you're in healthcare, education, a government sector, a regulatory body, what is the cost of our silence and what is the cost of our neutrality? What outcomes will come about when we do nothing on talking about navigating Indigenous identity fraud in the era of truth and reconciliation, where we are actively recruiting elders, cultural advisors, Indigenous executives, Indigenous leaders, Indigenous project leads, Indigenous consultants? What is the cost of that silence? It will harm our nations. It will harm Indigenous staff who actively work in the organization, and it will have a tremendous impact to our working relationship with our partners as well, the other agencies and organizations that support the work that you do, and of course the broader community. And I'll talk more about this on later slides. Okay. As a teacher, I never ever take it for granted that we all understand what exactly it is, what pretendianism is. So let's start there and hopefully give us some common language, but also give us a common understanding of what it is not as well. And if you have questions around this, I welcome you to put it in the chat box as well. I'm just going to queue up my Q&A here just in case I see a question that kind of comes in. Oh, already I see some questions coming in. Sweet. Okay. All right. I love the questions coming in. You keep them coming. I'll continue on with the presentation and hopefully leave as much room as I can. But I'll monitor that in case there's something directly applied to what I'm sharing on the screen here. So by definition, and this is me loosely, looking to the different definitions I've come across from the latest podcasts, latest webinars and articles written by colleagues of ours across the country. Pretend Indianism is where a non-Indigenous person is falsely claiming Indigenous ancestry or identity, often for very own personal, academic, or professional gain, which is a really weird phenomenon because if you were in other generations like the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, this wouldn't have been a thing because you would have no opportunity for gain because we were at such a disadvantage in society, and we largely still are. However, because of the era of truth and reconciliation and decolonization and embedding Indigenous cultural safety, we're seeing more opportunities, especially in the realm of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. Organizations that are looking to be more inclusive, more diverse, that people gravitate towards an Indigenous identity to climb that corporate ladder. It is a form of cultural appropriation. You can steal somebody's identity. We know this. And stealing identity is taken from the community, taken from people who have experienced this the most. Um, the motivation here usually is attention seeking. So this I would probably apply to, Buffy St. Murray, who, was in kind of like the 60s and when music and culture and counterculture was a thing because of war times, I think standing out among a hippie culture as an Indigenous person who was not Indigenous, I think that claim to fame was largely on the foundation, on the footstones of popularity, of standing out, of getting attention. Today, I'm finding it a lot more in the context that we all work in, is around career advancement, healthcare, education, government. What I will say, lightly and with humility, and for all of my Indigenous colleagues on the line here, with an open heart and an open mind, pretend Indianism is not mistaken identity. It's not people who are reclaiming or are reconnecting with their culture, or adoptees navigating, complexity. That's not so much, but it does have a part to play in other conversations that intersect with pretend Indianism. And with that, I'm just usually, this one's more rooted in self concept, the concept of self. And for us as Indigenous peoples, this is the part that we need to figure out is if we are reclaiming our culture, if we are reclaiming our identity because it was interrupted or attacked by colonial ideology, we have to journey inwards and be mindful of the space we hold. We have to be mindful of the space we take up in career advancement, in the spotlight, and ask ourselves, should this space go to another person? And that's the best way I can address that is if we are reconnecting and reclaiming, because I identify as a culturally privileged person, but I'm also very corporately privileged as well by having years of experience in the corporate sector. Um, my corporate experience and my cultural experience have limitations. And so I'm very mindful as an Indigenous leader of the space that I take up. And that's why I have a very diverse team that supports the work that we all do because, maybe that space should go to somebody who is two spirit. Maybe that space should go towards an elder who has a lifetime knowledge and experience of cultural identity. Or maybe this space should go towards an Indigenous person who identifies as a woman, because I carry male privilege in a hyper colonial, hyper male supremacist culture in colonial Canada. So when it comes to, the reconnection of culture and Indigenous, the impacts on Indigenous identity, it does intersect with pretendianism, but we'll talk about that on later slides as well. What I will say here, and I'll underscore it, exclamation mark, is there's a huge danger in oversimplifying this conversation. And I say that about every issue that comes up in reconciliation, every issue that comes up in decolonization. Be very wary of people that overly simplify these very large, complex issues. Those are people that I'm like, small doses. when people are overly simplifying it, there's a lot of danger that can happen in there. There's a lot of um, unsafe practices that can manifest and provide really not cool outcomes at the end of the day. So really, really, if there's one thing you're walking away from this webinar, let it be this. In anything reconciliation, the oversimplifying of these conversations is a big danger zone. And of course, the impacts of identity fraud, on a nation level, what happens in our nations is it will erode our own sovereignty. And it can misappropriate voice, resources, and decision making. So I'm just going to pause there and let us all be with that. And for those of you who do have working relationships with your local land-based nations, your local nations, host nations, land-based nations, what does that look like with the erosion of sovereignty and misappropriation of voice, resources, and decision making? Because the space that we hold has a lot of influence, and that influence has this ripple effect, especially around leadership positions and spotlight places. When I say spotlight places, I'm thinking of cultural advisors, elders, knowledge keepers, performers like dancers and singers, artists. That's what I'm saying with spotlight. I say spotlight because those positions often come into corporate workspaces, but they may not necessarily have a leadership position, like an Indigenous executive or an Indigenous manager or an Indigenous board member. Maybe that the difference there, when I say spotlight, is more cultural, performative. Culture's coming into the organization, but there's still a huge realm of influence that plays out there. Staff, the impacts on staff is it can lead to lateral harm and often does. And of course, there can be a huge element of silencing and mistrust if our staff are not involved or are informed of Indigenous identity fraud should it happen. And then, of course, organizations at an organizational level, there's a huge reputational risk. There could be legal exposure. And then, of course, a really, really big fallout would be a breakdown of relational trust. So whoever your stakeholders are, whoever your partners are, wherever your organizational commitments are for Indigenous relations, whether it's First Nations, local Indigenous nonprofits, the Métis Nation of British Columbia, local Métis charter communities, what are your formal working relationships? It will have a breakdown of relational trust if we are not honoring of those and holding ourselves accountable. Okay, I only have like 5 more minutes here, and then I'm going to turn my attention to the chat box. So here's a little bit of a framework, and I am open to feedback on this. For all my Indigenous colleagues here, this is how, I'm just going to be very transparent with you. This is how we have been supporting not Indigenous organizations. This is how we have been supporting non-Indigenous organizations on navigating Indigenous identity in the workplace. And so this is like a very fluid, rough framework for staying in this place of relational accountability with this work, built on a firm foundation that is culturally safer around asking this question and being sensitive towards the impacts of identity. It's a framework meant to reinstill accountability for the organization. And of course, a place where we can stay with some integrity for culture, for being trauma informed, and being less oppressive when you have a very monstrous, large, gargantuan organization inviting an Indigenous colleague or somebody in and asking for verification or asking for Indigenous identity. Whew, that's a very intimidating space to be in. But there are ways around this. And I hope that, we walk away from this session not feeling like we have to police Indigenous identity. That's not our job. That's not our job. As organizations who want to work with Indigenous communities and Indigenous cultures, our job is not to police. But question, reflect, and be accountable to, always, always. I've learned from a colleague of mine, a relative of mine from Musqueam First Nation. Her name is Rihanna. Um, she said policing is a value of colonialism. It's a manifestation of colonialism. And I see this happening sometimes in the social justice sector where we try to police each other. You can say that, you can't say that, and we call people out of, social justice. And I'm like, that policing is a manifestation of colonialism. And I also lean on the words of Dr. Vicki Reynolds, who says, we can't fight oppression with oppression. So we have to be very mindful in the spaces that we hold. We want to reinstill and support the framework of responsible systems. We want to be transparent with the decisions that are being made. And of course, where we can take care of due diligence. And really, what I will say here is, when it comes to inviting Indigenous peoples to work in organizations, that usually falls towards your human resources department, the executives who will give the stamp of approval if they don't sit in the interview process themselves. Probably there may be some room, depending on your organization, for EDI consultants, equity, diversity, inclusivity consultants, HR staff, EDI leads. And then, of course, your Indigenous governance model. These all have to work as a wraparound approach and be on the same page around navigating Indigenous identity when you're recruiting, when you're actively recruiting people in. All of these need to be paddling in the same direction and have the same understanding. When I say Indigenous governance models, some of you have these and some of you do not. Some of you abide by a board where you might have a good promising practice would be to have an Indigenous representative on your board. If you don't have a full-on Indigenous board, that would be your governing body. Some of you might not have a board. You might have a specific Indigenous executive, so an executive director or a vice president, or some of you have an Indigenous manager, lead, director, special advisor, very senior level position. But however, I also look at less corporate means of governance and leadership as well. If you have elder advisor, cultural advisor who's not on the payroll, but definitely in a working relationship where you can compensate them by honorarium, those are great people to have a part of these conversations as well. Okay, last 3 slides, I promise. Here are some cultural safety tools in how our team has supported navigating in a culturally sensitive, trauma-informed way, asking for Indigenous verification. Number 1, start with the job description. Is your job description culturally safe? And can it be culturally safer? So therein we have the conversation around Indigenous self-identification, which is where you do not require verification. Self-identification means that upon hiring, upon applying, do you self-identify as an Indigenous person? First Nations, Métis, or Inuit in the context of Canada. And then, and for all my Indigenous colleagues, we've been at many different jobs and applications where we have ticked off that box and said yes. However, there's also a verification process. I recommend verification processes for executive leadership positions and positions that require a huge degree of cultural interfacing with the corporation or the community. Those are your elders, those are your cultural advisors. If that you are looking for hiring somebody in a very cultural position, you really don't want to be outed or ask the question, who are they and where do they come from? And you're like, well, they said they come from so and so, but then they cannot prove their track record. And I say that because I have worked in systems and organizations where somebody has been brought in to do cultural work and they don't come from that cultural background. They learned it from somewhere else, and then we fall in the pitfall of cultural appropriation. Does it mean that this individual wasn't raised in the culture or have expressed permission in the culture? Absolutely not. And yes, I'm going to say it, we do have big nations and big families that do claim non-Indigenous people by relationship, not by blood. But even if you were claimed and adopted into a family, it doesn't change your identity. It doesn't change your ancestry. It doesn't change, that cultural integrity of belonging to that cultural background. So again, this is where I would pose the responsibility and the accountability back onto the organization. Just because they were given the permission or by a family, and they might see it as cultural amplification or cultural appreciation, does it mean or doesn't it mean that that space should go to somebody who actually comes from that culture, who was born and raised in it, who was taught it? So that's the difference between self-identification and cultural or not cultural identity verification. So verification is proving your identity. And there are several ways of proving your Indigenous identity. So we do have the status card system. We do have the Métis citizenship cards, identification that goes along with your Métis citizenship. And because the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples honors and recognizes that every nation has the ability to determine its own citizenry, they can provide letters of support saying, yes, this person is of this ancestry who comes from this culture, they are ours. So we supported organizations to develop the language in their job posting, their interview process, and go through the verification process of, are you okay and are you comfortable? This is a high level position. This is an executive leadership position. And we have a duty. We have a duty for cultural safety and good working relationships with the nations and for cultural integrity for the person we hire. Are you comfortable in verifying your Indigenous identity? And if they're not comfortable, I would be very worried about the executive you want to hire into that leadership position because they're not going to interface with your Indigenous community probably on, the best working relationships. So if because of adoption, 60s scoop, all the other colonial harms, there is a letter of verification too. I've gone through that process with bursaries and scholarships. So when I've gone through bursaries and scholarships, if I really wanted a bursary, if I really wanted a scholarship, I would have to seek actually two different letters of verification. One was a cultural verification saying that I was involved in my community, that I did have a cultural background. And then two was from my nation saying, yes, Len Pierre is Catesy. He is one of ours, whether they like it or not. And then, really validate that identity. And then people are like, well, is that 100% safe, Len? Is that, going to make sure that you can just alleviate any identity fraud? I'm like, no, but at least you went through your due diligence. And then that's all we can do as organizations and teams is you can't control other people. You can't control, how people show up and what they tell you they are. Organizations do that all the time. We hear in the news and the media about healthcare providers in this province who have claimed to have a healthcare medical background and then were outed after like decades of doing it. So there are these natural cracks and crevices where people can fall through and get into the organization with that. But we at least want to add our own layers of security, our own layers of safety. But the foundation of that safety has to be our relational accountability to the Indigenous communities that we end up working with at the end of the day. Your internal staff and the Indigenous communities that you interface with. I usually ask that when I'm looking at job descriptions and whenever we're being brought in to consult on looking at Indigenous recruitment processes, that we have a very transparent interview process. Are you going to have a panel or you're just going to have a phone call? I've had a one-off phone call where I was literally hired on the spot. And then one of my executive positions where I was hired into, I had a panel of like 12 people in my interview, a 2-hour interview. 12 people. That was the biggest panel I've ever had. Then I came back for a secondary interview, and it was a very big job, and I really appreciated that they did it. I had a second interview where I think there was 20 people, and it was a very fluid, very relational interview process. And then, of course, do you have a short-term interview process or do you have a very long-term interview process? Short-term means it's a phone call and one virtual meeting, or are you going to have 3 to 4 different meetings before we come to the place of hiring? And when I advise organizations, I'm like, it's not just you hiring; they're hiring you as well. So hence, the accepting of an invite to be hired. And when I'm looking for Indigenous specific positions, is that position scaffolded with support so that they're not the lone tokenistic Indigenous representative for the entire organization? Who are their support people, and how do those other support people also have duties and obligations to Indigenous projects and initiatives? Number two, culturally safe for interview processes. So, do you have an Indigenous representation on your interview panel? Does it always need to be there? Not necessarily. It depends on the context of your job description. And of course, traditional corporate interview processes are very transactional. We're going to ask you a series of questions, and at the end, you get to ask a series of questions, and then we'll let you know the next steps. Very transactional. If you're hiring elders, cultural advisors, or Indigenous executives, vice presidents, executive directors, I would advise a more relationship driven model of an interview process. This I learned from rethinking, revamping how we recruited elders and cultural advisors into universities. We did not want an interview process because how do you fit culture and cultural knowledge into a transactional interview process? So we developed a relational model that was a series of coffee and tea chats where we just got to visit, we got to go out into the land and territory and get to know each other as employer and possible employee and really develop a relationship. And then from there, it was more of a feelings based, gut based decision on whether or not this person wanted to work with us and if we wanted to work with this elder or cultural knowledge keeper. Number three, what is the role, and this is just a question, this is what is the role of the nation and your company accountability to navigating Indigenous identity? So again, thinking back to who are the Indigenous leaders in your organization, board members, executive directors, vice presidents, whoever they are, they need to have an integral role. It's also important to know the second bullet point here. Indigenous identity is not equivalent to readiness and is not equivalent to competency. So Indigenous identity alone is not a qualification. This I see with um, people who find somebody internally who's already built into the organization. And with all due respect, this person had just found out that they had Indigenous identity and they were already in an executive leadership position. And when it came to finding another Indigenous executive, they're like, oh, well, this person just found out that they're Indigenous. So they check all the boxes and they were just given the position without going through the fair due process. And I was like, okay, there's a whole bunch to unpack there ethically and when it comes to values for doing this work. People who have just recently found out that they are Indigenous, is a lot different than people who have been in the organization, have been navigating racism, discrimination, oppression, colonial violence, corporate violence in the workplace. And so I find that there's this culture among, sorry, HR professionals, sorry, executives on the call. There's this culture in very large organizations where HR and executives are like, this one's easy. There's somebody already here. And then elevate them into the position. I'm like, that is not what you want to do for transformative pieces. For transformative pieces, sometimes you don't even want to hire internally within the organization because they've been in the organization long enough to either, well, mind you, there are some feisty people who are like, no, I've been here long enough. I know what the issues are. And, I think I'm on a leadership platform. I can challenge them. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have people that have been in the organization so long that they've, this is what I call drank the colonial Kool-Aid or the corporate Kool-Aid and assimilated into the organization. And now we just want to go through the tick boxy, without challenging or confronting colonial and oppressive systems. So ultimately here, when we're talking about equity is about fair assessment, not about symbolic appointment. Holy moly, I'm running out of time. Okay, last two. When to pause a hiring process is whenever questions come up from your staff or from the applicants and the organization, HR executives who have their hands on the recruitment. If you don't feel like you're not equipped to address those questions, Pause. Pause, because there's some ethics and values here that need to be addressed. Then you want to come back to the key stakeholders, partners, Indigenous leaders to recenter and reground yourself. And number five, how and when to seek guidance is seek guidance early on in your recruitment process, not once the job has already been posted. If you've already done it though, that's okay. That's okay. But for next time, we want to address this earlier on in the conversation. We want to engage people with a clear scope, compensation, and consent, and use guidance to inform systems and processes. So if you are seeking guidance from Indigenous professionals on how to recruit, um, listen to their advice. If you're going to a nation to ask how we should be recruiting people, listen to their advice and their recommendations. Otherwise, it becomes a form of tokenism. Lastly, this one's really self-explanatory. When concerns arise, when the stuff hits the fan, so to speak, please remain calm. Do not panic. Do not gossip. Do not confront. This is a chance to kick in our training and pause, assess, seek guidance, protect your staff, and of course, document the decisions that are being made. Okay, that's it. I promise this is the end of the presentation. As promised, with just about 12 minutes left for our Q&A, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here and open the floor. Bonnie, I've seen that you've had your hand raised for some time. I'm just going to see if I can invite you to unmute yourself and bring your question, if that's okay. Oh, your hand has come down. Okay. Okay, attention to the chat box. I'm going to go up a little bit earlier to where questions were coming in. Yes, sorry, but what do you really mean by the term oversimplifying the topic? Can you expand a little bit more about that? Yeah, so oversimplifying this would be if somebody comes in and says, it's just like this, or it's just like that. Just oversimplifying these complicated, complex issues. When we come in and we're like, just do this, just do that, just do this, we're not navigating the complexity of the issues. So that's what I mean is when we're oversimplifying it. And if you're working with an Indigenous consultant, professional leader who says, oh no, that's easy, it's just, you just have to do this, that's oversimplifying it. When people present to me anything overly simplified, when it gets a complex nature or a complex issue, my little kicks in and I'm like, we need to pause and just ask a couple more questions. So just being very mindful of the advice and recommendations that are coming our way from folks in this conversation. From Camille, thank you for breaking down this important topic. I am asking early, apologies if this is coming up in your session, should Pretendianism, among other equity-denied groups, be examined through the lens of how this is experienced among Indigenous peoples? For example, should non-Indigenous communities look at in trying to address this issue among other equity-denied groups? Well, I don't know. I would say that really depends on the climate and the context for your own organization. This is where I say we cannot have a blanket wide approach for every organization. There are probably, over 100 different organizations that are represented on this call here, and no one of you are probably going to have the same type of processes because you need to examine your own relationship with Indigenous nations, your own Indigenous staff, your own equity denied groups. So it's really, really hard to say. And I can't speak for other equity denied groups. I think that this is quite rooted in culture, it's rooted in experience, it's rooted in privilege, and it's rooted in navigating colonial systems. So, if you're looking at other, equity denied groups among LGBTQ2+, I think that's a conversation for, people whom this topic matters the most, LGBTQ2 folks. Nothing about us without us. And because EDI is not my realm, I have lots of friends, lots of colleagues and partner organizations that we work alongside. I have not seen the same issue arise with Pretendianism, people that are claiming to have equity problems in their professional, personal lives, and then falsely claiming to have those. I have not seen that. If you have, let me know. How do you recommend organizations support Indigenous verification without putting the burden on Indigenous colleagues? That is, how do settlers act in this space appropriately so Indigenous people aren't in a position to have to deal with the violence of confronting someone engaged in pretend Indianism? Really, really good question. How do settlers act in this space appropriately so Indigenous people aren't in a position to have to deal with the violence of confronting somebody? So this is where Indigenous representation is key. So with all due respect, there's a really two incredible large corporate systems that approached us and they said, we're hiring an Indigenous executive position. And we hear all this public discourse on pretend Indianism, and we don't want to be in that pitfall. And we're not Indigenous, we're settlers. How do we do that? So we came in with the principles, the ethics, and the values and the lived experience being Indigenous. Been Indigenous my whole life, I think, and then supported the process from job description to job posting to selection process to relational interview process to the offering of a job. So the non-Indigenous person did not have to ask the question. And they were very transparent. The HR professional and the executive were like, we feel like it's not our place to ask the question. And I'm like, you're right. It's probably not your place to ask the question. We will ask the question and we'll back it with cultural safety language, and we'll back it with transparency so that it's rooted in cultural safety for the applicant and the communities that this organization serves. That's how we got around that pitfall. All relational, trauma informed, so that it was in a way that was meaningful for the applicant. And the client was like, well, what if they refuse to, to go through the verification process? And I was like, then they're probably not the people you want to hire, because this was a job that was going in front of chiefs across the country. It was an executive level position that was going in front of a lot of other Indigenous leaders. This is probably not somebody that you want to have in that same realm of understanding. So that's a very high level one. And that's going through the verification process. And sometimes you don't always need to go through the verification process. I've gone and had many jobs where it was not verified, it was by self-identification. Hopefully that helps. Oh, although reducing and eliminating fraud is important, wouldn't verification by corporations extending colonial practices? Prove your status. Is this kind of identity modeling something that could be appropriated in other ways in the Canadian employment or other landscape? Well, exactly. And I think this is why I wanted to have this conversation. Is it a colonial practice? 100%. But it's kind of the wretched hand that we've been dealt given this phenomena we found ourselves in. And so, again, rather than thinking of this in right or wrong, this or that, I hope to equip teams and organizations with broader awareness and broader tools for doing this work. Because if you are hiring an Indigenous executive or an Indigenous person with a very public facing cultural interface, so cultural advisors, elders, knowledge keepers, I'm like, you might want to verify that because of the potential harms you can have for the organization and harms you can have for the communities you work with. So it's like lesser of evils, it's like perpetuating colonial agendas, which the entire organization is colonial in nature as well. And there's just some things that you can't get around that's colonial in nature. Processes, deadlines, payroll, bylaws, policies that are in your organization. There's some negotiables and there's some non-negotiables. So decolonization and cultural safety is not black and white. It's really using the best of both worlds, two-eyed seeing, to be more safer. So if you're grounded on the foundation of being trauma-informed, being less oppressive, but cultural safety for your team and organization and the communities you work with, verification is just one of the tools that you can use. Oh, yes. Thank you, Jamie. Advisory is also an incredible, great governing body as well. So if you do not have an Indigenous board member, CEO, VP, or executive position, a lot of organizations have an advisory today as well. And they can be a great go-to for that authority piece. It doesn't always have to be an external consultant. I'm worried for people who use a mixture of teachings from different nations and claims 60 scoop, but wasn't transparent about family history, but now is working deep in the Native community as a track record or proof for their eldership. So, I think that that's speaking a lot of worries to a lot of different people. Lateral cultural appropriation does happen in our communities. We always think of cultural appropriation as like a non-Indigenous person appropriating Indigenous culture, but we have a lot of this actually because of colonialism, lateral appropriation that happens as well. So people from one Indigenous culture taking, adopting cultural practices from many different cultures. Um, and then, of course, if it's 60 scoop, of course, absolutely. This is just the complexity. This is the complication with Indigenous identity today. And again, it's a big red flag, I think. It's an element of risk if we have people that are refusing to go about, the identity process. But it has to depend on the work too and the work that they're doing. So if they're doing a lot of cultural work in communities and nations, that's up for those communities and nations to be able to, pick who they invite in. So I really want you to think about your own invitation here. As corporate organizations, you all have your own invitations for how you work with Indigenous individuals and communities. We as First Nations communities, we have our own way of inviting in who is coming into our organization. So I'll never go into a First Nations community and be like, did you verify? Did you know this? I don't want to police identity. However, there are principles and values and ethics that I abide by that, I use to mitigate harm. If someone married an Indigenous person, will they be known as Indigenous? No, they will not. So, marrying into an Indigenous family does not change your identity. It does not change your ancestry or your lineage. It does change your relationships to the work. People who are married in are often really great allies. I will say that. That has been my experience. They're often really great advocates, but it does not just be marrying into a family does not make you, there's a difference between racial identity and culture. People can be non-Indigenous and be immersed in culture all the time and use that to kind of find their way into taking up space. But this is where this is all rooted in the concept of self. How am I taking up space, and should this space go towards another person? Even for myself as a First Nations cisgendered man, I need to be mindful of the privilege I carry and the space I hold, because should it go towards another Indigenous person? So even for allies, we need to ask ourselves, I need to be mindful of the space I hold, and should this go towards another ally or actually an Indigenous person? Chantel, I see your hand is up. I'm going to see if I can unmute you here.